6 months of 65-hour weeks. 6 months of arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving at 9 at night. 6 months of weekend check-ins and emergency calls during family dinners. And then Marcus Chen, my team manager, looked me in the eye during our quarterly review and told me I lacked focus. I remember sitting in that sterile conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, watching him flip through my performance evaluation with the kind of casual indifference you'd reserve for a grocery list. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was delivering his assessment of my supposed inability to concentrate, I was mentally cataloging every single decision, every email, every project deliverable that had brought us to this moment. You see, I'd been documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. When you're the senior systems analyst for a mid-sized logistics company, and you're the only person who truly understands the intricate web of legacy databases, custom integrations, and regulatory requirements that keep the operation running, you learn to protect yourself. You learn to create evidence of your value because in corporate America, perception often matters more than reality. The documentation folder sitting on my desk back in my cubicle contained exactly 437 files. I knew the number because I'd been meticulous about organization. Every project specification, every troubleshooting session, every late-night system recovery, every process improvement suggestion that had been implemented without credit. All of it time-stamped, cross-referenced, and backed up in 3 separate locations. Marcus continued his critique, explaining how my recent performance had been disappointing, how I seemed overwhelmed by basic responsibilities, how perhaps I needed to consider whether this role was still the right fit for me. His voice carried that particular brand of corporate condescension that middle managers perfect over years of delivering bad news while absolving themselves of any responsibility for creating the conditions that led to it. I nodded appropriately, asked clarifying questions about his expectations, and accepted his developmental feedback with the kind of professional grace that had kept me employed for 12 years. But internally, I was calculating. I was remembering the Saturday morning 3 weeks ago when I'd single-handedly restored our entire customer database after a catastrophic server failure, saving the company approximately $2 million in lost revenue and regulatory fines. I was thinking about the integration project I'd completed 2 months ahead of schedule, enabling our biggest client to launch their new product line on time. The meeting ended with Marcus suggesting I take some time to reflect on my career goals and consider whether I was truly committed to excellence in my current position. He recommended I schedule a follow-up meeting within the next week to discuss my path forward. The subtext was clear: improve immediately or start looking for other opportunities. I returned to my desk and opened the documentation folder. The first section contained project summaries from the past 6 months. 23 major initiatives, ranging from system upgrades to process optimizations to emergency repairs. Each entry included the original request, my analysis, the proposed solution, implementation timeline, and final results. The average project completion time was 18% faster than company standards. The success rate was 100%. Section 2 documented my availability and response times. Every after-hours call, every weekend login, every vacation day interrupted by urgent requests. The data showed I'd been available for emergency support 96% of the time, including a 3-week period where I'd been on call 24 hours a day while we migrated our core systems to a new platform. Section 3 was perhaps the most telling. It contained every email, every meeting note, every informal conversation where I'd provided technical guidance, solved problems, or prevented potential disasters. The folder showed a clear pattern. I wasn't just doing my job, I was functioning as the institutional memory and technical backbone of the entire IT operation. The documentation also revealed something else. Over the past 6 months, as my workload had increased exponentially, my official responsibilities had gradually been redistributed to other team members. The interesting projects, the high-visibility initiatives, the career-advancing opportunities had been assigned to colleagues while I handled the critical but unglamorous work of keeping everything running. I'd become the person who fixed problems rather than the person who created solutions. But I'd also become indispensable in ways that weren't immediately obvious to someone like Marcus, who measured productivity through easily quantifiable metrics rather than system stability and long-term operational health. That evening, I began preparing for our follow-up meeting. I spent 2 hours organizing the documentation into a presentation format, not because I intended to defend myself, but because I wanted to ensure Marcus fully understood what he was suggesting when he questioned my focus and commitment. The next morning brought a crisis that perfectly illustrated the gap between perception and reality in our organization. Our primary customer service system crashed during peak morning hours, creating a cascading failure that affected order processing, inventory management, and shipping coordination. Within 15 minutes, we had angry customers, frustrated sales representatives, and a logistics manager who was calculating the cost of delayed shipments. Marcus was in back-to-back meetings, so the emergency response fell to me. I spent the next 4 hours diagnosing the problem, coordinating with our hosting provider, and implementing a temporary workaround that restored basic functionality while I developed a permanent solution. By the end of the day, not only had I resolved the immediate crisis, but I'd also identified and fixed 3 underlying vulnerabilities that could have caused similar failures in the future. The effort required me to cancel my lunch break, skip a training session I'd been looking forward to, and work until nearly midnight to ensure the system was stable before the next business day. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous, high-pressure work that kept our company operational, but rarely generated recognition or career advancement. When I finally left the office, I added the incident to my documentation folder. The new entry brought the total page count to over 800 pages of detailed records, showing exactly how I'd been spending those 65-hour weeks. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. I arrived 10 minutes early, bringing with me a bound copy of the documentation folder and a simple agenda I'd prepared. Marcus looked surprised when I placed the thick folder on the conference table between us. He opened the meeting by asking whether I'd given serious thought to our previous conversation and whether I felt ready to commit to the level of focus and dedication required for success in my role. I responded by asking him to review the documentation I'd prepared, explaining that I thought it might provide useful context for our discussion. Marcus flipped through the first few pages with the kind of polite attention you'd give to a colleague's vacation photos. But as he continued reading, his expression began to change. He started moving more slowly through the pages, occasionally stopping to read entries more carefully. After about 10 minutes, he looked up and asked where I'd gotten all this information. I explained that I'd been maintaining detailed records of my work activities, partly for my own project management purposes, and partly because I'd learned that in technical roles, it's important to document your contributions for performance evaluation purposes. I mentioned that the folder represented about 60% of my actual work output, since I hadn't documented routine maintenance tasks, informal consultation, or the various small fixes that kept our systems running smoothly. Marcus returned to the folder, now reading with obvious concern. He spent particular attention on the section documenting my response times and availability, cross-referencing dates with his own calendar. He paused at the entry describing the database recovery from 3 weeks ago, asking several questions about the timeline and impact. 20 minutes into his review, Marcus asked if I had a digital copy of the documentation. I explained that I'd created a comprehensive digital archive, complete with email attachments, system logs, and project files that supported each entry in the folder. I mentioned that I'd also prepared a summary analysis showing productivity trends, project success rates, and operational impact metrics. The meeting took an unexpected turn when Marcus asked me to walk him through the most recent system failure and my response process. As I described the diagnostic approach, coordination with external vendors, and implementation of both temporary and permanent solutions, I watched him realize that he had no idea how complex the work actually was, or how much institutional knowledge was required to handle it effectively. By the end of our meeting, Marcus had completely shifted his approach. Instead of discussing my supposed lack of focus, he was asking about my workload distribution, resource requirements, and suggestions for improving team efficiency. He seemed genuinely surprised by the scope and complexity of the work I'd been handling, particularly during the past 6 months. But the real revelation came when Marcus asked about my career development goals and whether I felt adequately supported in my role. It became clear that he'd been evaluating my performance based on participation in meetings, completion of training modules, and other visible activities that had nothing to do with my actual contributions to the organization. The documentation folder had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It hadn't just demonstrated my value to the company, it had exposed the fundamental disconnect between how my work was perceived and how it actually functioned within the organization. Marcus was forced to confront the reality that his evaluation criteria were not only inadequate but actively counterproductive. Over the following weeks, several changes began to occur. Marcus started attending our weekly technical meetings, asking questions about system architecture and operational challenges. He began including infrastructure stability metrics in his monthly reports to upper management. Most importantly, he started advocating for additional resources and recognition for the technical team. The documentation folder also sparked broader conversations within the IT department about workload distribution and career development. It became clear that several team members were experiencing similar challenges, handling critical but invisible work while being evaluated on more superficial metrics. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I approached my own career management. The process of creating comprehensive documentation had forced me to articulate the value of my work in terms that non-technical managers could understand. I'd learned to translate technical achievements into business impact, to quantify the cost of problems prevented, and to demonstrate the strategic importance of operational stability. 3 months after that initial performance review, I received a promotion to senior systems architect, along with a substantial salary increase and a team of junior analysts to help manage the workload. Marcus personally recommended me for the position, citing my exceptional technical skills, comprehensive understanding of our systems, and proven ability to handle complex challenges under pressure. The promotion came with an interesting conversation with Marcus about leadership and management styles. He admitted that he'd initially misunderstood my role and contributions, focusing too heavily on traditional productivity metrics rather than the specialized nature of technical work. He learned that managing technical professionals required different approaches and evaluation criteria than managing sales teams or administrative staff. But the real validation came 6 months later, when our company underwent a major systems audit in preparation for a potential acquisition. The auditors requested comprehensive documentation of our IT infrastructure, operational procedures, and historical performance data. My documentation folder, which had grown to over 1,200 pages, became the foundation for our compliance package. The audit revealed that our systems were not only more robust and well-maintained than the acquiring company had expected, but that our operational procedures and documentation standards exceeded industry best practices. The auditors specifically noted the quality and comprehensiveness of our technical documentation, which enabled them to complete their assessment in half the expected time. During the acquisition process, I was identified as a key technical resource and offered a senior position with the combined organization. The new role came with expanded responsibilities, a significant salary increase, and direct reporting to the CTO rather than a regional manager. Looking back on that initial performance review, I realized that Marcus's assessment of my focus wasn't entirely wrong. I had been unfocused, but not in the way he meant. I'd been focused on the wrong things, on simply doing excellent work rather than ensuring that excellent work was visible and properly valued. The documentation folder had been my way of creating that visibility, but it had also been something more important. It had been my way of taking control of my own professional narrative, of refusing to allow my contributions to be dismissed or undervalued simply because they weren't immediately obvious to someone who didn't understand the technical complexity of the work. The experience taught me that in today's corporate environment, competence alone isn't sufficient for career success. You need to be able to articulate your value, demonstrate your impact, and advocate for your own professional interests. The documentation folder had given me the tools to do all three effectively. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had shown me the power of preparation and strategic thinking. By maintaining detailed records of my work, I'd been able to respond to an unfair evaluation with facts rather than emotions, with evidence rather than arguments. The folder had transformed what could have been a defensive conversation into a constructive discussion about organizational needs and professional development. The approach I developed, comprehensive documentation, strategic communication, and proactive career management, became a model I've since shared with other technical professionals facing similar challenges. The key insight is that visibility and value are not the same thing, and that creating appropriate visibility for your work is a professional responsibility, not a personal failing. Marcus and I developed a strong working relationship over the years that followed. He became one of my most effective advocates within the organization, partly because he understood how close he'd come to losing a critical resource due to misunderstanding and mismanagement. He also became a better manager overall, learning to adapt his evaluation criteria to the specific needs and contributions of different team members. The documentation folder still exists, though it's now maintained as part of our standard operational procedures rather than as personal career insurance. It serves as institutional memory for our technical team and provides new managers with insight into the complexity and importance of infrastructure management work. But for me, the folder represents something more personal. It represents the moment when I learned to value myself appropriately, to demand recognition for my contributions, and to refuse to accept inadequate evaluation of my professional worth. It was the moment when I stopped being a victim of organizational politics and started being an active participant in my own career development. The experience with Marcus also taught me about the importance of communication and education in professional relationships. His initial misunderstanding of my role wasn't necessarily malicious, it was simply uninformed. By providing comprehensive documentation of my work, I'd given him the information he needed to make better decisions about team management and resource allocation. This lesson has shaped how I approach similar situations throughout my career. Rather than becoming defensive or frustrated when my work is undervalued, I focus on creating clear, compelling evidence of my contributions and their impact on organizational success. I've learned that most managers want to make good decisions. They just need better information to do so effectively. The documentation approach has also influenced how I think about professional development more broadly. I now maintain ongoing records of my achievements, challenges, and learning experiences, not just for performance evaluation purposes, but as a tool for personal reflection and career planning. The discipline of regular documentation forces me to think strategically about my work and its alignment with my long-term professional goals. Over the years, I've refined the documentation process, developing templates and systems that make it easier to maintain comprehensive records without creating excessive administrative overhead. I've also learned to tailor the documentation to different audiences, creating technical summaries for peer review, business impact analyses for management evaluation, and strategic assessments for career planning purposes. The approach has proven valuable in multiple contexts beyond performance reviews. When applying for new positions, I can provide concrete examples of my contributions and their measurable impact. When negotiating salary increases, I have comprehensive data to support my requests. When mentoring junior colleagues, I can share specific examples of how technical work translates into business value. But perhaps the most important benefit has been the psychological impact of taking control of my own professional narrative. The documentation process has given me confidence in my abilities and contributions, making me more effective at self-advocacy and career management. It's eliminated the frustration that comes from feeling undervalued or misunderstood, because I have concrete evidence of my worth. The experience with Marcus also highlighted the importance of understanding organizational dynamics and management perspectives. His initial evaluation of my performance was based on his understanding of productivity and success metrics, which were appropriate for other types of work, but inadequate for technical roles. By providing education about the nature of systems administration work, I was able to help him develop more appropriate evaluation criteria. This insight has shaped how I approach communication with non-technical stakeholders throughout my career. I've learned to translate technical achievements into business language, to quantify the value of operational stability, and to demonstrate the strategic importance of infrastructure management. These communication skills have been as valuable for career advancement as technical expertise. The documentation folder approach has also influenced my approach to team management in my current role. I work with my team members to help them maintain their own professional portfolios, providing guidance on how to document their contributions and communicate their value effectively. I've seen how this approach can transform talented technical professionals into confident, strategic career managers. Looking back, I realized that Marcus's initial assessment of my focus was actually accurate in an unexpected way. I had been unfocused on the wrong things. I'd been focused on technical excellence rather than professional advancement, on solving problems rather than gaining recognition, on being valuable rather than being visible. The documentation folder had helped me develop a more strategic approach to career management without compromising my technical standards. The experience taught me that professional success requires both competence and advocacy, both technical skills and communication abilities, both individual achievement and organizational understanding. The documentation folder had been my tool for developing these broader professional capabilities while maintaining my technical identity and values. Today, when I mentor other technical professionals, I often share the story of the documentation folder and the unforgettable meeting with Marcus. The story resonates because it demonstrates that you can advocate for yourself professionally without compromising your integrity, that you can demand appropriate recognition without becoming political, and that you can take control of your career narrative without sacrificing your commitment to excellence. The documentation folder represents more than just a career management tool. It represents a philosophy of professional empowerment. It's about refusing to accept inadequate evaluation, demanding appropriate recognition, and taking responsibility for your own professional success. It's about understanding that your value to an organization is only as strong as your ability to communicate and demonstrate that value effectively. The meeting with Marcus was indeed unforgettable, but not because of any dramatic confrontation or emotional outburst. It was unforgettable because it represented a quiet but decisive moment of professional self-advocacy, a calculated response to unfair treatment, and a strategic demonstration of value that transformed both my career trajectory and my relationship with organizational leadership. The documentation folder still sits on my desk, no longer as a defensive measure, but as a reminder of the importance of professional preparation, strategic thinking, and confident self-advocacy. It reminds me that in the modern workplace, your ability to articulate and demonstrate your value is as important as your ability to create that value in the first place. And sometimes, when faced with a challenging situation or difficult management decision, I remember that moment when Marcus opened the folder and realized he'd been completely wrong about my focus and commitment. I remember the power of preparation, the importance of evidence, and the value of strategic patience in professional relationships. The folder had given me something invaluable: the confidence to know my worth and the tools to prove it when necessary. In a world where technical excellence often goes unrecognized and specialized expertise is frequently undervalued, these tools have proven to be the difference between career frustration and professional fulfillment. That's the real lesson of the documentation folder and the unforgettable meeting with Marcus. It's not about revenge or vindication. It's about professional empowerment and career control. It's about refusing to be invisible, demanding appropriate recognition, and taking responsibility for your own success story. The 65-hour weeks and 6 months of intensive work had indeed demonstrated something important about my focus. They'd shown that I was focused on the right things: operational excellence, organizational success, and professional integrity. The documentation folder had simply made that focus visible to someone who had initially failed to recognize it. And that recognition, once achieved, had transformed not just my career, but my understanding of what it means to be a strategic professional in today's complex organizational environment. The folder had been my tool for creating that transformation, but the real change had come from within: the decision to value myself appropriately and demand that others do the same.